The ancient Greeks built the foundations of Western philosophy, democracy, mathematics, and literature. Their origin story, passed down through centuries of classical scholarship, was simple and geographically tidy. A Mediterranean people, rooted in the Aegean world, descended from those who had always lived around those seas. Herodotus wrote that the Greeks and Egyptians and Phoenicians were all branches of an ancient Mediterranean cultural tree, connected by trade myth and shared proximity to the sea that defined their world. This narrative was not just historical. It was civilizational identity, the story Western culture told about its own deep roots. It survived essentially intact through 2,000 years of scholarship, through the Renaissance recovery of classical texts, through 19th century German philology, and the birth of modern archaeology. The Greeks were Mediterranean. Everyone knew it. Then ancient DNA arrived in the Aegean world, and the story that had been told for 2,000 years was fundamentally revised. The story of ancient Greek origins is actually 3 stories layered on top of each other, separated by thousands of years and multiple demographic upheavals. The first layer is the original hunter-gatherers of the Aegean. The second layer is the Anatolian Neolithic farmers who entered Greece from western Anatolia around 7000 BC. and built the first agricultural communities of the Aegean world. The third layer is the component that neither classical scholarship nor early archaeology anticipated finding at all: a substantial genetic input from the Eurasian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, carried into Greece by migrations from the north that were not part of any historical or mythological narrative. The Greeks themselves preserved. The first piece of evidence comes from the Minoan genome, one of the most anticipated findings in Bronze Age ancient DNA. The Minoans, the Bronze Age civilization of Crete that built the palace at Knossos, produced the artwork and writing system that predated Linear B, had been the subject of intense speculation about their origins for over a century. Their language, written in the still undeciphered script called Linear A, gave no linguistic clues to their roots. Their artistic style seemed to connect them to Egypt and the Near East. Some scholars proposed Minoan origins in North Africa or the Levant. Others suggested they were an autochthonous Aegean development, with no clear outside source. A 2017 study by Wolfgang Hack, David Reich, and colleagues at Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, combined with a landmark 2023 study by Iosif Lazaridis, specifically targeting Bronze Age Aegean populations, provided the clearest picture yet. Minoans showed genetic profiles consistent with Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the same population that had entered mainland Greece from western Anatolia around 7000 BC. They were not from Africa or the Levant. They were a continuation of the Anatolian Neolithic farming population that had entered the Aegean and developed in relative isolation on Crete, its own distinctive civilization across 2,000 years of Bronze Age development. The Mediterranean connectivity theory was partly confirmed. The Minoans were genuinely of the eastern Mediterranean world, descended from Anatolian farmers who had colonized the Aegean islands during the Neolithic, but they were not connected to Egypt or North Africa through population movement. Their artistic and cultural parallels with the Near East reflected trade and influence, not ancestry. The second piece of evidence came from the Mycenaeans, the Bronze Age Greeks whose civilization Homer wrote about, the people of Agamemnon and Achilles, the builders of the great fortified palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos. The shaft graves of Mycenae, filled with gold masks and swords and silver vessels, had long been seen as evidence of a wealthy and powerful people whose origins were lost in the prehistorical past. The Mycenaean genetic profile showed the expected Anatolian Neolithic base, carried forward from the Neolithic farming populations that had occupied mainland Greece since 7000 BC, but added component of ancestry derived from the Eurasian steppe, the genetic signature of populations that had migrated into Europe from the grasslands north of the Black Sea during the 3rd and 2nd millennia. The Mycenaeans were genetically distinct from the Minoans. They carried steppe ancestry that the Minoan Cretans largely lacked. Typically, the steppe component in Mycenaean individuals represented roughly 16% of total ancestry, smaller than the steppe contribution in Bronze Age Britain or the corded ware populations of Central Europe, but statistically clear and consistent across multiple sampled individuals. This steppe ancestry is associated, across the whole of Europe, with the expansion of peoples speaking early Indo-European languages. Greek is an Indo-European language. The steppe ancestry in the Mycenaean genome was the genetic trace of the people who brought the ancestor of the Greek language into the Aegean world. The words you read in Homer's Iliad carry, encoded in their grammatical structure and vocabulary, the influence of a people whose bones have now been genomically identified. The third piece of evidence was the linguistic implication. For decades, historical linguists had argued about when and how the Greek language arrived in the Aegean. The presence of steppe ancestry in Mycenaean Greeks, but not in the earlier Minoan Cretans, placed the entry of Indo-European language ancestors into the Aegean at a specific window after the Anatolian Neolithic period and during the Bronze Age, consistent with what linguists had inferred about the timeline of Greek language development from comparative analysis of the broader Indo-European family. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris and proved to be an early form of Greek. The tablets it preserves, administrative records of palace economies, inventories of goods, lists of workers, give us the Greek language approximately 3,500 years ago. The steppe ancestry in Mycenaean genomes tells us that the people writing those tablets carried the biological signature of the population that brought Greek's ancestor into the Aegean, alongside the older Anatolian Neolithic ancestry that constituted most of their genome. The DNA and the linguistics converged on the same conclusion. The Greek language arrived with steppe-derived migrants who entered the Aegean world sometime during the 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC and mixed with the existing Anatolian Neolithic-derived population to produce the historical Greeks. But here is where it gets complicated. The steppe ancestry component in Mycenaean Greeks was significant, but not dominant. Mycenaeans showed roughly 60 to 70% Anatolian Neolithic ancestry and roughly 16% steppe ancestry, with the remainder from local hunter-gatherer populations. The implications for how we understand the origins of Greek language are substantial. Proto-Greek belongs to the Indo-European language family, which developed on the Pontic steppe. The steppe migrants who brought their language to Greece in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age period were numerically a minority, perhaps a fifth of the ancestry of the population they settled among. Yet their language survived and became the dominant tongue of the region, eventually giving rise to ancient Greek in all its dialects. The language spread through prestige and probably through political dominance rather than through demographic replacement, as the steppe-associated populations who arrived in Greece and the Aegean appear to have held social and martial authority disproportionate to their numbers. The words that survive in Linear B, the administrative language of the Mycenaean palaces, are recognizably ancestral to Classical Greek. The same root words, the same grammatical structures, already fully formed in the palatial bureaucracy of the Bronze Age. The language of a genetic minority became the language of a genetic majority within a few centuries of their mixing. The DNA shows the biology. The Bronze Age archives show the cultural result. This was not a demographic replacement, comparable to what happened in Bronze Age Britain, where steppe ancestry overwhelmed the pre-existing population at nearly 90%. In Greece, the steppe migrants mixed with the existing Aegean population, and the cultural synthesis that resulted produced Mycenaean civilization. The steppe component provided, among other things, the language. The Anatolian Neolithic majority provided the population base, the agricultural systems, the social organization that had been developing in Greece for 2,000 years. The harder question is why the Greeks themselves had no cultural memory of this migration. The Greeks had elaborate origin myths, stories of autochthony, of people springing directly from the earth of Attica, of cultural heroes and divine ancestors whose lineages were entirely local. Hesiod and Pindar wrote of Greek peoples as rooted in their specific landscapes, since time immemorial. None of these myths encoded a memory of migration from the northern grasslands, of ancestors who had herded cattle across the steppe and crossed into the Aegean world by routes that the genomic data places in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC. The steppe component in the Greek genome represents a population movement that was large enough to change the ancestry profile and language of an entire civilization, but early enough, occurring approximately 4,000 years ago, that it was fully absorbed into cultural memory as simply how Greeks were. By the time the first historical writers were composing texts, The migration was more ancient to them than the Norman conquest is to us. There was no memory left to encode. The complication deepens when you consider what the Mycenaean collapse adds to the picture. When the Mycenaean palace states fell at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, the so-called Bronze Age collapse, Linear B, ceased to be written. The palaces were abandoned, and Greek literacy disappeared for 4 centuries. When the historical Greeks re-emerged, writing in the phonetic alphabet they had borrowed from Phoenicia, they were continuous with their Mycenaean ancestors, genetically and linguistically, but had lost the institutional and literary thread. They built their civilization on a foundation whose origins they could no longer access. The DNA gives us access to what they lost. Drive through the Greek mainland, and you pass landscapes that have been farmed, herded, and built on continuously for 9,000 years. The olive groves of Attica, the wheat fields of Thessaly, the sheep-grazed hillsides of the Peloponnese. Each one, layer of human presence, accumulating from the Neolithic to the present. The people who work that land today are biologically continuous with the Mycenaean Greeks, who were themselves the product of the Anatolian Neolithic farmers who came before them, who were themselves the successors of the Aegean hunter, gatherers who preceded agriculture. What the DNA has added to this landscape is a stratum that was invisible before genomics, the steppe component, arriving in the Bronze Age from the grasslands to the north, carrying a language that became Greek, mixing into a population that was already old and established, and contributing just enough ancestry to shift the genetic profile, and just enough cultural input to transform the language, while leaving no trace in any myth, any genealogy, or any tradition that the Greeks passed down to us. The civilization that invented democracy and philosophy and tragedy was built on the meeting of worlds that its own culture forgot had ever met. If you want to follow where the Aegean ancient DNA work leads next, because researchers are now sequencing individuals from geometric period Greece, tracing what happened to the population during the Dark Ages after the Bronze Age collapse. Subscribe. The genomic history of the classical world is being assembled one skeleton at a time, and what it shows is extraordinary. The question that stays with me: the steppe component brought the Greek language. The Anatolian Neolithic component provided most of the people. Which one is Greek? The answer clearly is both. And the answer to that question might be the most important thing the ancient DNA of the Aegean world has told us about what a civilization actually is.